This isn't the book that we're reading online, is it?
No. It is a different book than the one we're reading online.
Was that 5 books, or is this number 2 and
No, so if I just put like number 1, number 2, number 3, that's just the canvas. And then I'll tell you what I'm going to call those after the notes today.
So 5 books?
As of now, sure. There's also like 2 more we're going to get next semester in Ms. Jackson's office. So. I just liked the PDFs that I found, I think had better readings on like World War I and World War II than the books that we have. These books these books I gave you are important for what we need to do also. All right, here we go. So talking about war, talking about how World War I was fought. So far we've talked about the causes of war, we talked about some war plans. And it is important because they called it the Great War before we had World War II. But this Great War, you're going to have larger armies, and we talked about that with militarism. You're going to have much higher casualties. We talked about that because you're going to have more people fighting. You're going to have better weapons. And this is also the first war where you're going to have the entire population of countries. And we're going to talk about the United States today, how the United States, even the population at home, was fighting for the war effort, involved in the war effort. And you're going to see, especially we're going to talk about the United States, the government specifically is going to gain kind of stricter control and gain some power during World War I. The Industrial Revolution was a huge impact of World War I, and you can kind of think of this, I always say the last kind of major war that y'all talked about in American history was the Civil War before we get to World War I. And during the American Civil War, you do have this high casualty count. It is called the first modern war. However, it's still before the Industrial Revolution, or at least the Industrial Revolution in the United States. You're going to have mass communication. However, we do know that mass communication still isn't very effective because they're still in the movie sending the little guy to go save his brother's battalion, having to run all across German lines. And on a global scale, this is definitely the first total war, because you're also going to see a huge amount of civilians being affected. So we talked about the Schlieffen Plan. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this because we did talk about the war plans, but the Schlieffen Plan was Germany's plan. They were going to go through Belgium pretty quickly. They were going to attack and capture Paris. So here's Germany right here. Their Schlieffen Plan, they're going to move quickly through Belgium, capture Paris, knock out France, and then they're going to focus all on Russia. That was the expectation. However, in reality, it was this domino effect of the alliances, because Great Britain is going to jump in and help little old Belgium. Just remember, Belgium, they didn't even pick a side. They're just like, we want to stay out of it. Russia, thanks to that ally of France, they're going to mobilize quicker than Germany expects. And then you have kind of Austria-Hungary begins getting split between Serbia and Russia because they're trying to help Germany. In your reading, you'll look at the battle at the River Marne. That is an important battle. And basically what happens is both sides end up digging in and kind of sitting in this stalemate of trench warfare. Because of this new invention of the machine gun. Playing defense is a lot easier than having a frontal assault. So you have a lot of people just kind of bunker down, and you can have one guy with a machine gun, and thanks to the machine gun and automatic weapons, you could have 50 guys run at him, and he can probably kill a lot of them, or at least wound and stop a lot of them from coming up. The trenches at first kind of started as basic little just defense positions. Then you probably saw in the movie, those of you who watched the movie, you saw how sophisticated the trenches became. You had the front line trenches, then you had kind of support trenches, I guess movable trenches, and then you had the secondary trenches. And then you had the commander always had its little bunker. It's also hard to maneuver armies through trenches. You saw in the movie how the guy was going towards the front lines, everyone else was coming back, and he was literally just bumping everyone, and he was getting everyone else mad because he kept hitting everyone. Those few guys were trying to get casualties out, and he hit one of the wounded guys and almost got into a fight that way. So it wasn't ideal. The hardest part about this trench warfare is that everyone is playing defense. In order to win, you have to break down their trenches line. This just gives you a little picture, this graph. So again, this is just one half. So no man's land is over here. What is no man's land?
The middle.
Yeah, kind of like the middle, kind of like the neutral ground, the ground that you're fighting over. In the movie, they were very hesitant because as soon as you kind of popped up into no man's land, you could get gunned down pretty quickly because you're just wide open, just kind of running. You have the first trenches right here. You have these support trenches as communication trenches. Here would be a bunker for the headquarters for the officers in charge. Like I said, it was very narrow. But you also might have seen in the movie that even though it was narrow, the guys towards the front had they would cut out little parts of the trench, and they were sleeping on the side, and people were walking, and the one guy even had a little fire. We're not going to worry about the 4 types of trenches. If you want to go back and look at this, you can. But again, on here you can see you have no man's land, the front lines, the support trenches, the reserve trench for the reserves. That just looks terrible. This is also why chemical warfare was so effective, because look at all those guys just kind of packed into the trench. If something happens, they're definitely not going to jump up and start running because they're going to get shot. So there's not much room for them to move around in these trenches. It's also damp and muddy, and like the movie talked about, there's plenty of rats everywhere. That was the Allied trenches. The German trenches were very different. They were way more sophisticated. And if you saw that in the movie for sure, you saw that when they kind of got to the German lines, the Germans had evacuated, so they didn't have to like fight through the Germans, those of you who didn't see it. But they get in and they just are like in awe. The Germans had like bunk beds and like cots in there, and they're like, holy cow. And then the one guy even said like, their rats are bigger than ours. in the movie, the Germans, when they had retreated, they had like set up these booby traps, and so it ended up like exploding on them, and then they had to run and jump over this mine shaft. It was all dramatic because the guy couldn't see. So the Germans had electricity, beds, toilets. It was way better, or at least more sophisticated. I don't know how much better it could be underground. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on just trench facts. Are there any questions about trench warfare?
Who built it?
The soldiers.
And doesn't it take a long time?
Yeah, but like I said, like at first, it was kind of like they kind of stopped at a defense position, and so they kind of probably just got a bunch of like machine guns placed up, and then after a while, they're like, we're not going to go anywhere. Like, let's just start digging in here. The two main fronts that you'll be reading about in the book are the Western Front, which is essentially the English Channel to Switzerland. I'm right here with the French and Germany. The United States is going to join this side. And then the Eastern Front is on the other side with Russia and mostly Austria-Hungary. Any questions about trench warfare? All right, so we're going to jump into America. Here we go. So how did the United States get involved into World War I? Before we talk about the home front. You remember I mentioned that briefly. Yeah, good. The sinking of the Lusitania. I'm going to write that down on the board. Lusitania. And what was the Lusitania?
A British passenger ship.
Good. It was a British passenger ship. Lusitania. It was a British passenger ship, and what happens to the Lusitania? It's sunk by what? A German U-boat. Good. And so remember, we talked about restricted and unrestricted submarine warfare. Restricted submarine warfare, like it's restricted, it has rules. And so in restricted submarine warfare, the submarine would go up and they would find your ship. They would surface up and they'd say, hey, we're going to blow up your ship, get everyone off. And everyone get off the boat, they sink the ship, nobody dies. In unrestricted submarine warfare, what happens? Yeah, they just shoot you and you'd have casualties and your ship would still sink. So what was so important about this British ship, the Lusitania? Good, Americans are on the ship, so this is going to piss off Americans. You're going to have our government probably use some propaganda to like promote this and get the people behind it. We also talked about another event or another thing. Good, the Zimmerman Note or the Zimmerman Telegram. The Zimmerman Note or the Zimmerman Telegram. And again, this was a German telegram intercepted and decoded by the British. And it was Germany asking Mexico to attack the United States, to distract the United States from getting involved in Europe. And so again, this is kind of more pushing that Germany is working against us. It's not so much that that's a huge major cause of war, but it kind of confirmed that Germany was working against us. Germany was our enemy. So here we go. Let's look at the home front. during World War I. There's a song, it's called Over There. I'll pull it up after these notes. I did not pull it up beforehand. But again, it's propaganda. 1917 Selective Service Act. What is the Selective Service? It's the draft. So boys, once you turn 18, you're going to get a postcard in the mail that basically says that you're enrolled in selective service, which means if we ever have a draft, you're eligible. How the draft works is they have 365 like balls into like a lottery thing, and then they pull out a date, and then it's by birthday. So that's how you get selected for the draft.
When do you think they'll put women on this thing?
I don't know. I don't. Okay, the answer to what I think, Coach Galt's opinion. Coach Galt's opinion is I don't think they'll ever put women on selective service. However, if we do need a draft, I think they will definitely take female volunteers, similar to what we do now.
Yeah.
But I don't think they'll ever put. I don't know. That might change. You're gonna have African Americans and Native Americans enlist in the military. We're gonna end up sending about almost 5 million, but only 2 million are actually gonna see combat. At this point, the African Americans are in segregated units. Meaning that they're in their separate units. The Native Americans are going to serve as messengers, and we're going to look at this in World War II as well. And the Native Americans are going to be using their language as the American code. And it worked so well in the South Pacific in World War II that the Japanese were never able to break our code with the Navajo code talkers. African Americans during World War I, this is a time period called the Great Migration. A lot of African Americans are moving out of the South, and they're moving up to these northern cities for work. So if you take almost 5 million white American men out of the workforce and they're going to fight the war, you're going to have almost now 5 million jobs that need to be filled. So you're going to have a lot of war industries work. We talked about in the previous slide how a lot of them are going to enlist into these segregated units. Here's a picture of a troop ship headed for France. Yeah, 100 years ago we still had race riots. So I don't learn anything. But labor is going to be a huge impact on the American people staying at home. you're going to see the creation of a War Industries Board. War Industries Board. And this War Industries Board, we're going to see this in World War I, and we're going to see this continue in World War II. But it's going to start telling factories what to produce. So it's going to take like automobile factories and kind of say like, hey, we need to start making tanks. We need to start making airplane propellers. So taking factories that we already have and just making war products. You can see on the right, women are also going to start working, and women are going to start working in factories. Some of these women that were working in like ammunition factories, they would be handling TNT, and they were nicknamed canaries because the TNT caused their skin to turn a yellowish color. You can see on the right, around 400 women died due to overexposure to TNT during the First World War. So not only African Americans are moving out of the South, getting these jobs in northern cities, you're also going to see women going to work as well. Women are also going to join the military. Again, 50 years earlier, 60-ish years earlier, you see the American Civil War. Nursing kind of starts to become a thing with Sarah Barton and the American Red Cross. You're going to see women doing clerical duties, so like secretary type work, radio operators. But again, how do we organize this war effort? The War Industries Board is going to be important because the War Industry Board is important because it's organizing factories, what to produce. We're going to look at the Food Administration here in a second. The Food Administration is head up at this time by Herbert Hoover. What else do you think of when you think of Herbert Hoover from American history? What do you think of? Yeah, the Hoover Dam. What did you say, Charles? Yeah, the 31st president. What else do you think of?
Valley.
Hoovervilles, that was what I was looking for. Hoovervilles, during the Great Depression. Thank you. You're going to have the Fuel Administration. We're going to be looking at, or they're going to be conserving fuel. How do we get fuel to the war effort? National War Labor Board. And some things that are going to happen in the United States is, first of all, unemployment is going to virtually disappear. And this is going to happen during both of the world wars because the men going to fight, they're getting paid to go fight. The job that they left has to hire somebody else. So you're going to see African Americans and women, both who are probably a huge part of that unemployment, move in to fill these jobs. You're also going to see this expansion of big government. So the idea that there is a war production board and they can tell the factories kind of what to produce or how much they need to produce. We're going to look at 2 laws that were passed in the expansion of big government and the excessive government and regulations in the economy. Number 5 is important. It kind of goes with the War Production Board in the fact that there's going to be close cooperation between the private sector, which would be like those automobile factories, those different factories, and the government. And then number 6, unprecedented opportunities for disadvantaged groups. So again, like the African American population, 60 years removed from the Civil War, this is the first chance for a lot of them to move out of the South. So hopefully you talked last year about the successes and failures of Reconstruction, how there are probably more long-term failures than successes. And so it's not until 60 years later in 1917, 1920, where you see these groups getting better chances. So the Food Administration, what do you think they were in charge of? Food, good job. You had these different kind of slogans like wheatless Mondays, meatless Tuesdays, porkless Thursdays. And what do you think those kind of meant?
They're saving their
Good, they're saving food for the war effort. On the piece of propaganda on the left at the bottom, it says to save for the Army and our allies. So again, you have to remember, before the United States joined the war, we were still sending a bunch of money with the, it's not the Lend-Lease Act, I don't know what we call it. We were still financially supporting both sides. We were definitely supporting our allies a little more. The advertisement on the left is saying that you can still gain protein from cottage cheese. So they're telling American people to eat cottage cheese so we can send the meat overseas. You do see rationing during this, and people would have to have ration cards where you could only get a certain amount of whatever good you're looking for. Right there it says 2 pounds per month in order to provide a restricted ration to England, France, and Italy. You can also see these are people who are breaching the rationing order. On the left, you can see the Lusitania is, that's Louisiana, never mind. I was like, that's not how you spell Lusitania. V is for victory. Victory gardens were a huge way that Americans could help with the food shortage. People were encouraged to plant victory gardens as a way to save food and grow food for their family. So you're not having to go to the store to buy fruits and vegetables. Again, you have the fuel administration basically doing the same thing, but with fuel and gasoline, carpooling. Liberty bonds and victory bonds. We're going to look at some statistics here. That the Austrian-Hungarian bonds and the U.S. bonds both raised the most. I don't know what the conversion from krones to dollars is, but 5 United States bonds raised $20 billion for the war effort. So this was a huge impact on the war budget. And again, they're going to be able to sell so many bonds because all of these people are going to have employment now. Again, propaganda is a huge part of World War I. The Committee of Public Information. I feel like Russia probably has a Committee of Public Information. They were producing propaganda and producing information that was definitely anti-German. This guy, George Creel, during this time was known as the propaganda minister. He's also pushing American culture. He's going to be pushing American culture in Europe for after the war, for when they rebuild. We're almost done. These are two important impacts of World War I on our home front. The first one is this Espionage Act. The Espionage Act of 1917. The government was afraid of German spies. And so the Espionage Act is going to forbade actions that basically obstructed the war effort. If you spoke out against the war effort, if you were creating things that were against the war efforts, that was obstructing recruitment, under this Espionage Act, you see that the postmaster was ordered to remove remove materials and propaganda from the mail. Do you guys see a problem with this? Yes. What's the problem with this? Yeah, it violates the First Amendment, it violates our freedom of speech, freedom of expression. The Sedition Act, again, it became a crime to speak against or print or write or publish any disloyal, profane, or abusive language about this form of U.S. government, the U.S. Constitution, or the U.S. Armed Forces. You're going to have a lot of people jailed under this Sedition Act. You can kind of compare this to the American Civil War when Abraham Lincoln suspends habeas corpus and starts arresting Southern sympathizers in the North. Why was Remember Belgium one of the main propaganda rallying points? What are we remembering about Belgium? What is being shown in the piece of propaganda? What did you say? Yeah, good. So civilians. So you see the guy on the right. You see the little point on his helmet. That was kind of notable for Germany during this time. The little points on their helmets. And so the figure on the left is clearly probably a female. Or it's made to look like a female. Destroy this mad brute. You're going to see this again in. You see this when you look up a lot of World War II propaganda. Beat back the Hun with Liberty Bonds. And then the Menace of the Sea. What is the Menace of the Sea referring to? U-boats. Any questions? It's like Coach Golf, stop talking. All right, on our new textbooks.